today, of course, the tragic deaths of those 3 U.S. soldiers who were taken so tragically in that drone strike on Tower 22 in Jordan near the Iraqi and Syrian borders. Well, we are now awaiting what a response might look like from the United States, from the Biden administration. We also are getting a better idea of which Iranian proxy group carried out this deadly attack. Before we get into all of that, let's hear from Fox News White House correspondent Peter Doocy on what the Biden administration has decided so far. Let's listen.
It's been 3 days since the deadly drone attack on U.S. troops in Jordan, and President Biden says he's ready to respond. The U.S. military is likely to strike multiple targets over the coming days, hitting back at the Iran-backed militias that have been responsible for more than 100 attacks on American forces since the start of the war in Gaza. And those attacks have continued, though the White House says they've been largely unsuccessful in recent days.
On occasion, those missiles hit. But largely, we have been able to defeat those attacks while they're either in the air or before they can even launch.
Those Iran-backed proxies are now starting to prepare for possible U.S. airstrikes. On Tuesday, the most powerful militia in Iraq, which is suspected of involvement in the drone attack, announced it is suspending military operations against U.S. forces in the region. And while Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill push for a decisive blow against the groups, the president says his main focus is on Iran. But a direct strike on Iran is unlikely at this time, with the Pentagon and State Department both scrambling to make sure the conflict doesn't develop into a regional war.
We take a wide range of considerations into account to prevent the situation in Israel and Gaza from expanding into a broader conflict.
In addition to the possible military action, President Biden is also pushing for new economic sanctions on Iran. At the White House, Peter Doocy, Fox News.
Well, Peter, thanks so much. In the meantime, let's talk about all of that and more even further with our friend, national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer, Hal Kempfer. Hal joins me. Hal, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. You have helped us make sense of this story for so long. I want to put up a tweet here from our friend at the Pentagon, Fox producer Liz Friedenhal. She says, in quoting John Kirby moments ago in the White House briefing on the U.S. response to the Iran-proxy attack that killed 3 American soldiers, Kirby says this, Hal, the first thing you see won't be the last. So what do you make of that? Also, NBC News is reporting this, that the response in retaliation will be a quote-unquote campaign that could last weeks, Hal. What does all of that mean? What do you have in store? I mean, what does your gut tell you about that? I mean, that's quite sustained, is it not?
Andrew, one of the big criticisms that they've had with the previous strikes or responses to attacks, which were not in Jordan, those were in Iraq and Syria, was they do what they call one-offs. They would go in and hit something, we'd see it, we'd see video of the attack, and then they'd sit there and wait, and of course, there'd be dozens of other attacks before we respond again. This one is different. I think they sense that the national mood is different on this one too. This one, it's not that it was an unsuccessful attack from the insurgent standpoint. They actually got in there. They 3 U.S. service members were killed. You got over 40 that were injured. Some of them seriously injured. And there is a desire to make this stop, but also to respond in a way that makes our intent understood. So what we're hearing is they have named the Islamic Resistance. This is an umbrella group. It includes the Hezbollah derivant that you mentioned, the one that said, "Oh, we're not going to do any more attacks." Well, a little late for that. Okay, you just did a big attack, so that's one where pretty much certainly Admiral Kirby has talked about this. General Ryder's talked about it, which is, yeah, okay, that's great, but it doesn't mean anything. All right, you already did the attack. Sure. So what they've done is they said this whole umbrella group. That tells me a lot of things from that. That tells me a wider variety of targets. That tells me it won't just be that one group. It could be other groups associated with them. It also implies, doesn't state, but it implies that they're going to go after what supports that entire umbrella organization, which is the IRGC, Al-Quds support that we see in Iraq maybe Syria, but definitely in Iraq, that they'll probably be looking at that for targeting, either as direct targets or as collateral targeting and hitting something else. But they're going to be looking at that hard. I'm not hearing anything definitive that indicates that we have any intent of actually doing targeting within Iran. I don't hear that. And I heard some discussion about maybe offshore stuff. That was something that was done back in the 80s under President Reagan, where we actually went after the oil platforms. That was a very different situation. I
Right.
recall that time period quite vividly in terms of what we did there. So that's a different situation. I've heard it talked about, haven't seen anything. But the other thing is the time period. This will not be a one off. Everything they've stated indicates that this will go on for quite some time. And what Admiral Kirby said was the first thing you see will not be the last. That's
Okay.
another way of saying you're going to see multiple strikes over multiple days, probably over multiple weeks. One of the reasons why is when they do a strike, immediately the Islamic Resistance forces, if you will, are going to take their assets or personnel and quote go to ground. They're going to try and hide them and stuff. But at some point, they can't stay there forever. They're going to move them. And as they move them, as we can spot them and identify them, kind of like what we're doing in Yemen with the Houthis, then we'll strike them. And I'm anticipating we're going to see something that looks a little bit more like the strikes in Yemen, which are ongoing. As a threat poses itself, we immediately get a mission on it and we take it out. So that's what it sounds like to me.
Okay, Hal, let's kind of break that down a little bit because yesterday when we were speaking, we got the news that this splinter Iranian proxy group known as Kataib Hezbollah, different from Hezbollah in Lebanon, but kind of similar complexions, obviously, that they were going to cease all of these attacks. And then we got the news today. You mentioned this U.S. officials deeming the culprit of these attacks this umbrella group, the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. And you can kind of make the logical leap here that that would include Kataib Hezbollah, in addition to other of these proxy groups here. And what is kind of, in charge of the Iran proxy group marionette, should I say, is the IRGC. Now, you said, and we've been talking to a lot of people, that they don't expect U.S. officials to strike with inside Iran. But what about something like we did in 2020, where we waited for then leader of the IRGC, Qasem Soleimani, to be in Iraq near the Baghdad airport? We took him out there in a drone strike. Could you see something like that happening against the leader of the IRGC now? I don't know who that is, but do you think that is on the table?
I would say if the leader of the IRGC was what's the word I want to use, dumb enough to go to Iraq right now, yeah, that person could probably be targeted. That would be a logical inference from that. I have a feeling that we're going to look at all sorts of IRGC stuff in Iraq. I don't think we're going to do any targeting near Baghdad itself. I would be somewhat surprised. That's a dense urban area. And I would imagine a lot of the targeting that will be done will be away from urban areas. I'm not ruling out select targets. One of the background issues on this, though, is there is tremendous pressure on the prime minister in Iraq to make an executive decision, which he has the authority to do, to ask for coalition forces to leave Iraq. And what everything else is said is the majority of the population of Iraq is Shiite Muslim.
Right.
There is a lot of affiliation, if you will, between the Shiite community in Iraq and Iran, because Iran is kind of the center of Shiite Islam in the Middle East, and so there's a lot of connections there and stuff. So there's a lot of political pressure on the prime minister right now. Of course, we talked about this yesterday. The problem is if he does that, we're what stands between him and a resurgent ISIS, possibly coming down and again redoing what we saw, say, 9 years ago.
Okay.
And the Shiite, they can do these little attacks and stuff, but they cannot stand up against a concerted army. We saw that 9 years ago.
Right.
Things haven't changed that much. So the prime minister knows strategically he wants to keep the U.S. forces there because we do a lot of good for the national security there. But with that said, we're going to be doing a lot of different strikes. I think we're going to do it in such a way as to minimize the consequences politically for the prime minister as much as possible.
I see.
So that we're not upsetting the balance of power, if you will, within Iraq. On the other hand, we're going to make a very concerted concerted message, if you will, in terms of targeting what we're doing. And we're really looking at degrading their capabilities,
Yeah.
kind of like what we're doing in Yemen.